Wolfgang, Dr. Wolfgang Smith, welcome to my podcast. This is the Footnotes to Plato podcast, which, as you probably know, I've borrowed from Alfred North Whitehead's remark that all of Western or European philosophy can be understood as a series of footnotes to Plato. We're going to talk a bit about Platonism today and about your own attempt to bring some clarity and make some sense of contemporary physics, quantum physics in particular. We might touch on relativity as well. I know you have some insightful thoughts about that. But to shed light on contemporary physics in light of this ancient wisdom coming out of Plato's dialogues and the tradition of Neoplatonism that followed in the wake of those dialogues. But I'd like to start on a more biographical note to understand a bit about how your own career unfolded and your own intellectual trajectory unfolded. I know you have degrees in mathematics and physics and taught mathematics for a number of years. How did you end up moving from physics and mathematics into the wisdom of the ancients and the work of Plato in particular? I take it you didn't start there, or maybe you did, but can you lay that out for us?
Well, I guess I really started with physics. I remember I was 14 years old and I became very curious to understand in a rather childish, simplistic way, no doubt, what the world is all about, what its structure is. And incidentally, it was at that time that I somehow acquired a copy of Whitehead's book, Science and the Modern World. So I read that when I was 14 years old. I don't know how much I understood at the time, but I was very excited about it. And in fact, I remember my mother would call me down to dinner and I would say, I can't come now, I'm thinking. So I was very interested, and it somehow meant a great deal to me to try to understand, in what was undoubtedly a very childish way, the structure of the world. And I conceived of it in terms of physics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know you did some important work on physics related to the re-entry of spacecraft into the Earth's atmosphere and so on. Yeah. But you also would eventually decide to study and teach mathematics. And so was there something about the way that physics was being practiced and theorized that led you to decide to move more into mathematics?
Well, actually, even at that early age, my ideas about physics and the structure of the world were very much at odds with the contemporary zeitgeist, the prevailing official worldview of our civilization. And I decided to get my PhD in mathematics and become a professor of mathematics, because actually mathematics is probably the only academic subject where one will not be accused, or in fact cannot be accused, of somehow violating the premises of our zeitgeist. So the subject of political correctness does not come up in mathematics, it cannot. And this is really one of the deciding reasons I picked that subject. I wanted to be free to think about matters of physics and philosophy without in any way being constrained by the norms of academia in this regard.
I understand. My next question would be, when you compare this modern zeitgeist, and in particular the approach to natural science that has really developed out of a kind of Cartesian framework, and the whole scientific revolution in the 17th century. How has that view departed from the view of the ancients like Plato as regards the nature of the cosmos, both in its physical dimension and perhaps its metaphysical dimension? What was it, in other words, that the ancient philosophers, Plato in particular, understood that modern science has forgotten or distorted?
Well, it's an excellent question. And I would say that the contemporary answer to these basic questions, in other words, the contemporary worldview, is really, strictly speaking, the diametric opposite of the Platonist. They are antipodal, because the contemporary worldview is really premised upon the belief that the things that compose our cosmos are made up of tiny little particles, however conceived. In other words, that it consists of wholes which are merely the sum of parts. And I would say that the basic ontological premise of not only Platonism, but all the profound ancient metaphysical schools is the opposite, namely that the real entities which compose our perceptible cosmos are what I call irreducible wholes, which means that they are something more than simply a sum of parts. And so I think this is a central conception in Platonist ontology, that being is an irreducible whole, which means that it precedes ontologically the spatio-temporal atomization, if you want to call it that, which pertains to the entities that we perceive in our daily life. To the contemporary scientist, all these entities are sums of parts. Doesn't matter whether you conceive of these parts in classical physics or in quantum theory. They are sums of parts and nothing more. And the Platonist says, no, mistaken. The real entities, the entities that have being, are not the sum of parts. They are more than that. And in fact, they pre-exist in an ontological sphere where spatial and temporal conditions do not exist.
Might you relate this difference in how wholeness is conceived or misconceived, as it were, to mathematics and our conception of number, and say the difference between starting with a whole that can then be divided into individual numbers versus thinking of numbers as already individual and adding up to a whole? The Neoplatonic or Platonic view would seem to me to be that the ultimate is the one, and that the one can divide itself or appear to divide itself, whereas contemporary physics and its reductionism, but also our understanding of number, seems to me to have a more additive character in which wholeness is something that is achieved by the addition of parts, right? Rather than preceding the parts, where parts would be instead a division from the whole. Is this, do you follow my distinction here?
Yes, what you have touched upon here is, in my opinion, very, very central to the entire problem of ontology, namely the Platonist and the Pythagorean schools looked upon mathematics in a completely different way from the contemporary. We can talk about arithmetic or geometry. I think what I'm trying to say now can be understood more readily in geometry. Take any geometric entity, say a line segment. To the contemporary mathematician, a line segment is a sum of parts. And ultimately, the ultimate parts are points. So ultimately, a line segment is conceived as a point set. Well, the important fact is that in the Greek and in the Pythagorean and Platonist schools, to be precise, a line segment was not conceived as a point set. It was conceived precisely as an irreducible whole. And so as something that pre-exists in a realm beyond the reach of space and time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And let me say that this is also why geometry was so highly respected in the Platonist schools and regarded as a means by which the mind of a human being can be elevated from the psychic to the intellectual realm, because the Platonists believed that, for example, the prototype of a line segment is in fact an irreducible wholeness, which as such is situated beyond space and time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And let me say that the development of modern mathematics, that is modern in the sense of post-Cartesian, following the so-called Enlightenment, the aim of mathematicians on a fundamental level was precisely to reduce mathematics to the level of point sets. And this was regarded as a great achievement. And in fact, our friend Alfred North Whitehead was very much involved in that. In 1913, he, in collaboration with Bertrand Russell, published that epochal work, Principia Mathematica, in 3 volumes. I think there are few books in the history of the world that have had a comparable influence, while at the same time being read only by a handful of people. It's so abstruse, only a handful of specialists have ever written this book. But let me just say that whereas contemporary mathematicians regard this as a landmark, a way of finally getting to the bottom of things, as a Platonist, I regard it in just the opposite way. It was a betrayal of what might be called the higher side of mathematics. From the standpoint of the Principia, you cannot have the foggiest idea even of what geometry meant in the Pythagorean Platonist schools. And I always like to remind people of that alleged inscription over the portal of Plato's Academy, which read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It's a very mysterious saying, but it alerts us to the fact that in the Pythagorean and Platonist schools, geometry played a very, very central role. And if you look at it from our contemporary point of view, from the point of view of Whitehead and Russell, that geometry that we now have set down as a standard, as the real geometry, has nothing to say anymore at all. In other words, the geometry alluded to in this inscription alerts us to the fact that to the Greeks, the great thinkers of ancient Greece, geometry was something very, very different from what we now conceive it to be.
Yes. The good news for our friend Whitehead is I think he and Russell had differing opinions about what was achieved in this series of volumes, the Principia Mathematica. There was a fourth volume planned on geometry. The first three focused more on arithmetic, right? But even on Russell's admission, the project failed because of all of the sort of logical tricks that were needed to make the argument work. He said at the end of it something like, his dream of clarifying the foundations of mathematics by grounding it in set theory, the logic of set theory, had failed and dissolved in a nest of confusion, I think is how he phrased it. And he was really disappointed by this, but Whitehead seems to me to have been quite liberated by this failure. And this was even before Gödel's incompleteness theorems kind of showed formally why it was destined to fail. But Whitehead was liberated from this in the sense that I see Whitehead as having a deeper grasp of the intuitive dimension of mathematics that could not be reduced to some series of logical deductions or formalisms, that there's a sense in which we're participating in these higher forms or patterns. And Whitehead would later say that he would try to define mathematics as having to do with the study of patterns and the relationships among patterns. And pattern is something that has an intuitive and almost an aesthetic dimension to it. And I think this sense of the harmony within pattern and between patterns is much more Pythagorean in orientation. And so the good news is I think Whitehead was not entirely convinced, even though he was a brilliant, logician who tried to carry this project forward with Russell, who started as his student, right? He wasn't at all, wedded to this project, I think. And his later, metaphysics, I think, shows the very different direction that he went in after this earlier phase of his career. We're going to talk about your book that's coming out, I believe, today, but maybe we can just dwell for a moment on the influence of Whitehead. You said that as a 14-year-old, you read Science and the Modern World, and that was very influential for you. I know you've also, in a number of your books, drawn upon Whitehead's famous fallacy of misplaced concreteness as a criticism of contemporary science and physics, and also his protest against the bifurcation of nature between the so-called primary characteristics, which could be measured and quantified, and the so-called secondary characteristics, everything subjective and qualitative, which would be, concerned with the inner experience of human beings, which for materialists amounts to little more than a kind of illusion or projection. And science is really about putting those qualitative illusions to the side to get to the real quantitative, measurable heart of the world. So what do you find so important about Whitehead's protest against this bifurcation, and what would science look like if it overcame this?
I would say that the fallacy, what Whitehead calls the fallacy of bifurcation, is absolutely fundamental to an understanding of physical science, which, as it were, liberates us from a tremendous illusion which has now become practically universal. It is very hard to go through a course of studies in a contemporary university without coming out on the other end as a bifurcationist. And bifurcation is a complete inversion of the truth. Let me try to explain it as simple as possible, what bifurcation affirms. It is an ontology, a metaphysics introduced. Well, actually, it was first introduced by Democritus about 400 something BC in this famous fragment of his that the naive believe in color, the bitter and the sweet, but in reality, there exists only atoms and the void. This is basically the ontological position that bifurcation imposes upon us, not because it's true or has been verified, say, by empirical means, but simply because a priori it leaves no other alternative but atoms and the void. And incidentally, this philosophical postulate of Democritus was very much attacked by Plato and his school, and was very quickly abandoned by the well-informed. So for about 2,000 years, the philosophically informed public knew that this was a primitive heresy that had been disproved, and they did not entertain a bifurcationist Weltanschauung. And it was in the 17th century, at the hands of René Descartes, that this ancient heresy was reintroduced and has since then become the fundamental metaphysical premise of Western civilization. That's what you learn in so-called higher studies in philosophy departments. So I think it's important to understand the background. Also, it is important to understand that this is a pure assumption for which there are not, and in fact cannot be, any kind of evidence. It is pulled out of thin air, and however, it is the metaphysics that our scientists, especially our physical scientists, have, so to speak, imbibed as if with their mother's milk, I mean, unknowingly, through the education to which they are subject. They come out of it as bifurcationists. And the interesting thing is that if you try to explain to them that what this bifurcationist postulate affirms and why it is drawn out of thin air without any actual support, they do not understand what you're talking about, because it is something that they have assumed. It's part of their fundamental Weltanschauung, and so they are really incapable of entering into a debate on that. It is simply a postulate which they assume unknowingly. They are not aware of the fact that they are metaphysicians, that they do make a metaphysical assumption which is basic to all of their physics. They do not understand that, and anyone who's ever tried to converse with physicists about this issue will, I think, confirm what I'm saying. It's almost impossible. And Alfred North Whitehead was one of these. For decades, he went to all the big universities in England and America and lectured these people on the A, the unfoundedness, and B, the damage to physics itself that this postulate causes. And there has been almost zero acceptance in the scientific world of what Whitehead had to say.
Yeah. It's as though a methodological shortcut which would allow one to build toy models of the universe, which may have some predictive success and technological application, became mistaken for or gradually became reified as a metaphysical presupposition, and so reified, in fact, that it became unconscious, that the physicists nowadays don't even recognize, as you're saying, that they are unconscious metaphysicians who have removed themselves and everything subjective and intelligent from the universe so as to gain access to a very simplified toy model of what the universe is and how it might operate. This has led to some technological innovations, but it has also left physics in a state of deep ontological confusion. And I take it that many of your books, but including your more recent book, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology, is an attempt to bring some sense, common sense, back into physics. Quantum theorists, Nobel Prize winning quantum theorists like Richard Feynman are famous for saying things like nobody understands quantum physics, and even affirming and celebrating the absurdity of nature as he understood it. This seems to me, from a philosophical point of view, to be an example of just how muddled, to use one of Whitehead's favorite words, contemporary physics has become, that physicists would be celebrating the irrationality and absurdity of the picture that they're presenting to us of how the physical world operates. So let's get into your proposals here for a new ontology for quantum physics. Can you lead us into your distinction between what's described in quantum physics and what you call the corporeal realm, and how physics has become ontologically confused about what is real versus what is a artifact of their means of calculating what is real?
That's a very wonderful question. I think the first point that should be made is concerns perception and the most important case here, of course, is visual perception. Until Democritus and Descartes came along, all the world believed that we do perceive the external world. When we look at the world with our normal eyes, what we see is not a res cogitans, a thing of the mind. We see external objects of many kinds. And more or less at the time of Descartes, a theory of visual perception imposed itself upon Western civilization, which is called the retinal image theory. And if you study cognitive psychology at any university, I would strongly imagine that this is what you will be presented with, not as a theory, but as simply the way things are. And I think we all understand basically what this visual retinal image theory has to say. It recognizes that, in a sense, perception starts on the retina, where light impinging upon the eye causes electric impulses, which are then channeled into various so-called visual centers in the cortex. Last I heard, there were 20 or 21 such visual centers. And an enormous amount of information has been gathered. I'm sorry to say that tens of thousands of monkeys have had to pay with their life for this information. But in any case, this is science. There's no question about it. The trouble is that these visual centers only take apart the visual, the retinal image. And so you have 20 different outcomes of that. And as the experts in that field admit, we now see how the visual cortex takes the image apart, but, quote, we do not yet see how it puts it back together. And the answer to this question, I'm totally convinced, is and can only be this, that the neuronal mechanism does not put the image back together again. In fact, it can't. So the end product of this immensely complicated neuronal mechanism in the cortex, the end product of it all is many different versions of the retinal image taken apart. And so it emerged from these considerations that the neurophysiologist has a big problem, and this problem was called the binding problem. How do you pass from a million on-off positions of neurons scattered throughout various centers in the cortex of the brain to an image of a red rose? And I answered this problem in the only way I believe that it can be answered. I think there is no other way. And the answer is based upon the Platonist ontology. And what is that answer? Well, according to Platonist ontology, the cosmos breaks into three levels, or planes, if you want to call it that. The highest, what I call the Platonists call it the intelligible realm. The point about the intelligible realm is that it is not subject to either space or time. And this is where everything starts. This is where the irreducible wholes which constitute what we call being, originate. They originate in this intelligible realm. On the opposite extreme, the third level is the corporeal world as we know it through sense perception. And in between, and this corporeal world, as everyone knows, is subject to both space and time. And now, in between these two extremes, we have what the Platonists call sometimes the psychic realm or the vital realm. I call it the intermediary. And the point is that the intermediary realm is subject to the condition of time, but not of space. And so the binding problem is resolved and can only be resolved. There is no other way. It can only be resolved on the intermediary level, where the spatial separation of these millions of neurons is transcended. What binds these neuronal states into a unity, a oneness, which is what we visually perceive at any instant of time, what binds this multiplicity into a unity is a principle pertaining to the intermediary realm, that means subject to time but not to space. And let me just say that in days gone by, every child knew exactly what that principle is. This is the soul, the anima. So man, if man consisted only of a corporeal body without an anima to enliven it, visual perception would be impossible. Because what makes it impossible is the binding problem. Here on the corporeal realm, the process of visual perception ends in a vast multiplicity. And there is not a scientist in the world who can scientifically explain to you how that vast multiplicity of neuronal states is brought together into the form, say, a landscape that you perceive visually.
Yeah.
So
I want to invite you to transition into the relevance of quantum physics in a moment, but it seems to me, just on this issue of visual perception, that we can stick just within the corporeal realm and understand that one of the mistakes that leads to this problem, the binding problem, that many cognitive psychologists have been making, is that there's this implicit presupposition that somehow the brain and the body are separate from their environment. When in fact, as Whitehead's always pointing out, the boundary between what's inside the body and outside the body is very fuzzy. And rather than having to concoct this whole, what is sometimes also called the representational theory of perception, where there's supposed to be a kind of neurally based language of thought inside the skull that's representing and reassembling the sense data coming in from the outside, there never was a time when the brain or the retina, the eyes, were separate from the surrounding world. It's all sort of energetic process relating to itself. And so one can remain within the domain of just the corporeal. And indeed, you draw on Gibson's theory of ecological perception. And so far as I know, he wasn't a Platonist, but nonetheless recognized the need to put the brain and the body back in the world, and to see how our visual perception is a kind of participatory affair where just by virtue of the way that light reflects off of objects in our environment, there's far more, we're bathed by far more information than what can be represented on the two-dimensional surface of the retina, and that our capacity to perceive depth and so on can only be explained with a realistic understanding of perception as actually participating in the world and not separated off from it within the skull, as though there was a little man watching a projection on a screen inside of our heads, right? But what you're proposing, this deeper Platonic ontology, gets us into this other problem in cognitive science, the hard problem of consciousness. And it seems to me that on strictly physicalist grounds, there simply should be no consciousness. There should be no visual perception at all in the sense of a conscious perception. And so that there is consciousness suggests to me that, and should suggest to cognitive scientists, that they're making some ontological mistakes earlier in the process of reasoning that led to this so-called hard problem of consciousness. The solution to the hard problem of consciousness is to change our ontology ultimately, right? And so this Platonic vision of a threefold order of reality, I think, is one way of doing that. But if consciousness didn't exist, there wouldn't be any science, so we wouldn't be asking these questions. We would simply be, zombies. So this seems quite obvious to me that we need to make some changes in our underlying ontology. Now, when you talk about the intelligible, the intermediary, and the corporeal realm, there's a way of interpreting quantum physics and making sense of quantum physics in terms of this scheme, right? Can you lay out for us what, say, the wave function, Schrodinger's wave equation, what is it describing, and how does it relate to the corporeal world of our sense experience and the intelligible world that would be the ontological source of our of the realm of appearances that we sense? And situate us in your Platonic interpretation of quantum theory.
Well, it's an excellent question, and it is a question that I think can be answered meaningfully only after the heavy lifting is done to put contemporary physics on an ontological basis, which I believe can be done only on Platonist grounds. And I think this is really the reason why Feynman has very astutely made this observation, which has become very famous, namely, quote, "No one understands quantum theory." I think this is literally true, that what it really means is that if you look at the world through Cartesian eyes, as almost every physics professional does, then quantum theory is a realm that makes no sense. You cannot really understand what it deals with and why, what gives it a kind of correctness, a kind of validity. I have become absolutely convinced that in order to answer this question, you have to abandon bifurcation, abandon the almost instinctive way Western thinkers now conceive of the so-called physical universe, and look at the entire problem from a Platonist point of view, where you have this tripartite cosmos, and then the answer to this question, what is quantum theory? And of course, that also implies that you answer what is classical physics. You can't understand quantum theory unless you also understand classical physics in the bargain. The point is that both of these sciences are, as it were, calling out for an ontology, because the ontology that springs from the Cartesian axiom of bifurcation just doesn't work. It makes no sense. And on that basis, you really do not understand physics at all. It's not just quantum theory that's not understood, less obviously, but equally, in equally rigorous sense, you do not understand classical physics at all. So what you're asking me is, how does, really two questions. First of all, what is the Platonist ontology of physics? How does a Platonist understand the ontological basis of physics? And how does that enable you to understand quantum theory? So these are the implications. Well, let me say at the outset, what I find so surprising is the fact that once you have grasped this Platonist tripartition into the intelligible, the psychic, and the corporeal, or the eviternal, the intermediary, and the corporeal, once you have understood this tripartition, the ontological understanding of physics comes out very simply, very rigorously, and it leads to a clear, sharp understanding of classical physics on the one side and quantum theory on the other. You see that physics naturally breaks into these two disciplines. So, since you've answered the question, let me try to answer it as simply as I can, but it will take a few minutes. I mean, I said it's simple. Every child really can understand it, but even so, it requires a bit of concentration to go through the steps of this interpretation. So according to Platonist metaphysics, all being comes or derives from the eviternal plane. You see, it's the exact opposite of the contemporary scientific outlook, which thinks that things come from below, from quantum particles. These particles unite into bigger and bigger aggregates, and voila, the things of the corporeal world and whatever lies beyond are formed in this way. No, it's just the other way around. The first thing to understand is that the Platonist ontology distinguishes between being and non-being. And a mere sum of parts entity, the sort of thing that a physicist conceives and works with, is not regarded, is not viewed in the Platonist ontology at all. Ontology deals with being, and what is that? It is an irreducible wholeness. So if you will, the entities comprising the corporeal world break into two kinds. The kind that the physicist works with, understands, and can tell you about, and these are sums of parts realities. And from a Platonist point of vantage, a sum of part reality is not has no being at all. It is a kind of a phantasm. So being, from a Platonist point of view, is an irreducible wholeness, which means it is a manifestation in space and time, if so be it, of something that actually transcends space and time, something that is intelligible to the intellect. And the difference between intellect and reason is that intellect deals with irreducible wholes. Ratio, or reason, deals with sums of parts. So the kind of mathematics that ends, that the Principia Mathematica, Whitehead and Russell describes, is a mathematics of ratio. It is a mathematics of reason. It is completely outside the mathematics of being, the Platonist Pythagorean mathematics. It has nothing to do with that. Okay, so there are then in the corporeal world these two kinds of realities, what the Platonists called being and what the contemporary physicist deals with, which happens to be a mere sum of parts, and as such, it lacks being. So when I first began to observe this, I was rather fascinated to see that, strictly speaking, from a metaphysical point of view, there are in a way two different worlds, two different universes. The universe of the ontologist, which derives from the eviternal and is made up of irreducible wholes, and then the world of the physicist with his galaxies and his black holes and this and that. These are all sum of parts realities, which actually the Platonist doesn't even see and doesn't want to see, because there's no being there. The Platonist is interested in being. And incidentally, every living organism is a being, from the amoeba to the anthropos, and therefore cannot in principle be comprehended on the basis of physics. Now, of course, the physicist can tell you many things about the body, and it's obviously what he has to say can have empirical validity, but yet in a sense he doesn't even see the organism, because the organism is not a sum of parts. The organism is an irreducible whole. And when our scientists in the 19th century talked about élan vital and all these things, they were simply alluding to the fact that only from a Platonist point of view can you really understand a living organism. And obviously, physics can say certain things about it, but what it says, what it talks about, always is below the ontological level of an organism. So biology is a closed field to the physicist. So the world then consists, in a sense, there are two worlds in which we live: the Platonist world of irreducible wholes, and the physicist's world of the 10,000 things which he talks about. And incidentally, you may ask the question, does he construct these things or does he discover them? The answer is a little of both. So the first thing that the ontologist must teach the scientists is the distinction between, if you will, the really real world, which consists of irreducible wholes, and organisms are part of that, and then the empirical world, for lack of a better name, which is the world, which is how the scientist, the physical scientist conceives of things. And that's something entirely different. You cannot confuse these two. But the beauty is that in a certain sense that only the metaphysician can understand, you can really say that the difference between the world of the metaphysician, which comprises irreducible wholes, and the world of the physicist, which comprises these sum of parts entities, the difference is the one is real, the other is not. In the final analysis, it comes down to that. There's an interesting line in one of the Vedic scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, which says, the unreal never is, the real never ceases to be. The conclusion about these two, the discernment, is rightly perceived by the seers of truth. It's a wonderful statement. When you ponder it, you see it hits the nail on the head. The unreal never is. The things that the physicist talks about, it never is. And please understand, it doesn't mean to say that it's just imaginary or anything like that. No, I'm using technical language here. You have to, otherwise you get nowhere. So there are these two worlds, and now that I have hopefully explained that, the question arises, what does that imply regarding physics? That's what we need to ask ourselves now. Well, let me first of all point out the ontological definition or conception of classical physics. Ontologically speaking, there are corporeal objects. What does that mean? A corporeal object is an object pertaining to the corporeal stratum, which constitutes an irreducible wholeness. The physicist knows nothing about that because he doesn't talk about irreducible wholeness. He can't even conceive of it in physical terms because our mathematics does not describe irreducible wholes. Our mathematics is geared to point sets. So take an irreducible whole and a red apple, just to be concrete. So there is the corporeal apple, and it is something that we can perceive, and it is something that derives its irreducible wholeness directly from the aeviternal plane. There is a corporeal apple because before that, there pre-exists an intelligible apple. And so now that I have introduced this idea of corporeal objects, I can tell you from this ontological point of view what classical physics is about. Classical physics is the physics of subcorporeal entities. So take a corporeal entity, an apple, let us say, call it X. Associated with this X, there is a physical apple, which you can call SX. And this physical apple, incidentally, the corporeal apple is red and it is sweet and whatever other perceptible attributes it may have. The physical apple is neither red nor sweet because it is the apple as the physicist conceives of it. So it is fully describable in mathematical terms, except for one thing. And here we come to the crucial point. Since X the corporeal apple is an irreducible wholeness, so is the physical apple. The physical apple is still an irreducible wholeness, which in other words means that it has being. I've already, I think, explained this idea that being is the same thing as irreducible wholeness. So the point is that classical physics is subcorporeal, and this means that it deals with entities which have irreducible wholeness, entities which have being. Now, please note that what this entails that the objects of classical physics are more than what the physicist can conceive. Because the physicist cannot conceive and does not conceive of irreducible wholeness. That's a conception. There are no differential equations for that. That's an ontological conception. The point is, however, that unbeknownst to the physicist, every subcorporeal object is an irreducible whole, which means that it has being. Now, as I say, the classical physicist takes this for granted, and he cannot conceive of these things. They are beyond the vocabulary of physics. Now let us go to quantum physics, quantum mechanics. What are the quantum entities? Well, as we all would expect at this point, having already understood what I said a moment ago, we would certainly say that quantum physics deals with entities that are not subcorporeal. And the fact that they are not subcorporeal means that they have no irreducible wholeness. And this is where the weirdness of quantum theory comes in, because ontologically speaking, it deals with entities which have no being. No wonder no one understands quantum theory, because it is not natural for the human mind to think about things which have no being. It is also why it takes a while to learn physics. It's quite a job to learn to think about things that have no being. All right. Now, if that were the whole story about quantum objects, there could obviously be no quantum theory, because there can be no real physics, no real empirical knowledge concerning things that simply and purely do not have being. So somewhere along the line, being must come into the picture. How does it come into the picture? And the answer is really obvious. Being enters into quantum theory in the act of measurement or observation, because in the act of measurement or observation, the quantum non-entity comes into contact with a corporeal instrument which is endowed with being, is endowed with IW, irreducible wholeness. And in the act of measurement, this irreducible wholeness of the instrument induces an IW in the measured object itself. And incidentally, this is a rather technical thing in the book that you showed us a few minutes ago. I explain how this transfer of irreducible wholeness takes place. It takes place through a mode of causation which is primary, and by which actually the universe comes into being. And this is a mode of causation which differs radically from the mode of causation that physics deals with. Physics deals with a causation that takes place through some process moving through space and time. This is why you can write differential equations for it. But this is a mode of causation which incidentally is operative only on the corporeal level, not above, because there's no space above that level, only time and then eternity. So the point is that this transfer of IW from the instrument to the object of measurement takes place through what I call vertical causation, which is the primary causation of the cosmos. And this is a causation physics cannot understand. This is also why you see, for example, the famous measurement problem, when quantum physicists tried to understand how you measure a so-called quantum system and how that measurement instantaneously collapses the wave function and so on. They were completely mystified, and rightly so, because measurement cannot be understood in terms of horizontal causation. So the reason physicists never could, after almost 100 years, resolve the so-called measurement problem is very simple, because the act of measurement requires vertical causation. It cannot be understood in terms of horizontal causation. So I think I have now, I apologize for talking so long at a stretch, I don't think, but it was unavoidable. I have now really explained how, on the basis of simple, straightforward Platonist ontology, I can explain A, the rationale of classical physics, and B, the rationale of quantum physics. And let me assure you that in light of this explanation, all the pieces fit together. For example, if you think about the measurement problem, there are no more gaps. It all holds together, and you see that in terms of vertical causation and irreducible wholeness, it all fits together. In fact, it's easy. A child can understand it.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I appreciate you leading us through that. I wanted to get it on the table.
Oh, good. For a moment, I didn't hear you. Please go
on. I wanted to invite you to lay out this account, this Platonist interpretation of both classical and quantum physics. And I appreciate you leading us through it step by step. I recognize that there are some technicalities and that it can be difficult to just, rehearse it all impromptu like that. I thought you did a great job. I want to try to connect this to Whitehead's ontology and his cosmological scheme, and see in what ways you find it compatible or incompatible. When you talk about this three levels of being, the intelligible, the intermediary, and the corporeal, it strikes me that one way of translating this into Whitehead's scheme would be to talk about the corporeal as what he would call the realm of actual entities, and the intelligible as the realm of what he would call eternal objects. And then this intermediary realm is really the core of Whitehead's metaphysics. He comes up with this term concrescence to describe what goes on in the intermediary, though for him as a process philosopher, he's really trying to throw this whole scheme of levels into dynamism, into motion, as it were, such that concrescence, this process of becoming, is a description of how the potential which is his word for what the intelligible forms or the eternal objects are, their potentials in his view, how those potentials become actual, how in each moment of our experience, in each moment of any actual entity's experience, there's a process of concrescence whereby potentiality is becoming actualized. And in the context of quantum theory, Whitehead would say that, you know, what the wave function is describing is not something actual. It's describing the potentialities that are available in any given event or process of concrescence, and that as concrescence moves from through its phases of actualization, it's in a way collapsing the wave function, if you want. Now, you know, Whitehead's rendering of this is presupposing a non-Darwinian, but nonetheless evolutionary understanding of the universe, of cosmogenesis, as a process whereby ever more complex organisms are emerging, right? He would view organisms as an adequate account, not just of the biological realm, but perhaps, you know, you're familiar. He calls his philosophy the philosophy of organism because he thinks organism goes all the way down. In the sense, it describes the physical world just as well as the biological world. So galaxies and stars and so on, for Whitehead, they're species of organism. Atoms are species of organism, and evolution for him is this cosmic process whereby, you know, simpler organisms like atoms, through processes of creative relationship and emergence, eventually they eventuate in more complex organisms like human beings. And he does have a vision of the divine as luring this process of evolution forward. Now, I know you've disagreed with this vision that Whitehead lays out, but I do, while it's the question of time and evolution, right, where the differences arise. And I wonder, given the influence of Whitehead on your work, as we've already discussed earlier, his understanding of bifurcation and fallacy of misplaced concreteness, his critique of materialistic physics, and Whitehead's insistence on, you know, he says in Science in the Modern World, I believe, that in his view, a thoroughgoing evolutionary cosmology is incompatible with materialism, because materialism insists upon these fundamental particles that do not evolve and that are just sort of given. And so, given his view of evolution, which is quite different from Darwin's, which only applies to the biological realm, you know, Whitehead didn't think the Darwinian story of biological evolution was an adequate explanation for speciation or for living organisms. We can go into that if you'd like, but can you describe for me where you part ways with Whitehead and what it is that you find inadequate about his interpretation of these questions?
Well, I find it hard to believe that, for example, in the biological realm, there is any process at all which results in building complex organism out of simpler organisms. In other words, apart from the fact that the Darwinian mechanism, if you will, of random mutations followed by natural selection is utterly incorrect. There's no truth in that at all, and it's impossible. Apart from that, I do not think that this is how the higher species of organisms arrive in this world. I do not think that there's any process at all, Darwinian or post-Darwinian, that build, say, a mammal out of fish. I think this is pure fantasy. And actually, when you reflect upon what I said earlier, namely that every living organism is an irreducible wholeness, which means that it is not the sum of parts, which means that you cannot conceive it as a sum of parts. So I find it hard, Matthew, to conceive of Whitehead's process philosophy in terms compatible with Platonism. Now, perhaps it's just an inability on my part, but I must tell you, I'm very, very dubious that this can be done. If you reflect upon the fact that a living organism is an irreducible wholeness, then it seems to me quite obvious that the only way this irreducible wholeness can be put here is through an act of vertical causation originating in the intelligible realm. And you know Whitehead far better than I, perhaps you can correct me, but I do not see anything in Whitehead's philosophy corresponding to what I call vertical causality. A causality which acts instantaneously.
Matt, may I ask Wolfgang a question?
Sure.
Wolfgang, so I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. You know, you were talking about the integrally, every corporeal object is essentially tripartite, correct?
Yes.
Right. So your red apple example, there's a sort of aveternal core to that apple, and you could say that the existence of the parts, the corporeal parts of the apple, emanate out from the inner irreducibility, the inner being of that apple. I don't mean literally inner, obviously, corporeally inner. I mean existentially inner. Now, another thing with this is that I think that I wonder if you could speak to whether you would say that when you come from, and this is backpedaling a little bit, but I think it's still pertinent to what you guys are discussing here, that when you go from, when you're talking about a top-down versus a bottom-up kind of causality, from this top-down perspective, you can't. Well, we're all philosophy majors, so we all learned the principle at one point or another, whether we agree with it or not, that the greater cannot come from the lesser. That's, you know, which I hold to be a pretty powerful principle of ontological principle as well as logical principle. But in the case of the cosmic tripartition, you have essentially the many emanating from the one, in a sense. Would you agree with that?
Well, you can certainly say these words, but there is a likelihood that they will be misunderstood, because the emanation of irreducible wholeness from the intelligible to the corporeal plane, let us say, does not actually involve a lessening. There's no greater and no smaller here. The point is that the irreducible whole on the corporeal level contains within itself the irreducible wholeness, so there's no lessening. And let me say that if you realize the fact that there are wise men, and there have been, and there are people who actually are able to see on an aeviternal level. In their eyes, there's no lessening at all. What is here is also there, and what is not here is nowhere, as the tabula smaragdina. So these ideas went all the way into the Middle Ages, where people still understood Platonism. So that would be my answer to your question.
Right. Now, would you say alternatively, I think this is more to your language, that well, first of all, when you talk of pre-existence on the aeviternal, you don't mean that in a temporal sense. You mean that because we're talking about vertical.
There's no time
right.
on this.
Right. It's an ontological pre-existence. So
Yeah.
what we have in the case of, say, a corporeal apple, we have the aeviternal, which is fragmented. The descent from the aeviternal to the corporeal is a fragmenting of the being. And then furthermore, from the corporeal to the subcorporeal is a further fragmentation. And finally, the transcorporeal is ultimate fragmentation.
So I hope, John, I've answered your question, and I think we should go back to Matthew now and let him.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is helpful, though, in thinking about the relationship of the one and the many, and Whitehead's attempt to, I would say, integrate a more perennialist Platonic view of the nature of reality with a more modern view of creative evolution, if you will. He while he's calling his philosophy process philosophy, he's very clear in his book Process and Reality that we need to reconcile these two great intuitions of both flux and permanence. I would read Plato's cosmological dialogue, the Timaeus, as an attempt to do just this in a way, though Plato obviously gives pride of place to the eternal. Nonetheless, in the Timaeus, there's a description of an ensouled universe with life and motion. And there's something about the eternal forms that, at least as Plato often describes them, lacks life and emotion. This would be Whitehead's view. And so when you were asking, is there anything equivalent to vertical causation in Whitehead? And I think there is. He would describe this in terms of what he calls the primordial nature of God, which is an eternal vision of the intelligible realm that is, in a sense, incarnate in every organism's experience of the world. So God is present in each organism. God is present as what Whitehead calls the initial aim that shapes the experience of each organism or each concressing actual entity, again, to use his terms. And I take this as the way in which there's a whole to part causality operative in his cosmology, which is how I understand what you mean by vertical causation, a kind of whole to part, even though the part is also itself a whole. Every organism is an irreducible whole, but I think by virtue of this connection through vertical causation, whereas horizontal causation would be more of a part-to-part mode of causality. The problem with Whitehead is he had to invent his own rather idiosyncratic language in order to bring about this integration that he sought between a Platonic vision of the eternal and I think a more contemporary vision of a creative universe. So I think we're coming towards the end of our time together, and where I would like to end here is on this question of our religious and spiritual outlook. We've been talking mostly about science and how we understand the nature of reality and the nature of the universe. But when we think about our place as human beings in this mystery, I wonder about the role of history and the sense in which, particularly in the religions associated with the Bible, or the Abrahamic religions, even including the Quran, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, history and the history of the human community plays a very important role in the revelation of the nature of the divine and the purpose of creation ultimately. But I wonder, in the context of a more perennialist view, where it would seem as though historical process is in some way an illusion, what meaning are we to make as human beings of our history, where we've come from and where we're going, if in some sense the truth, as I understand the perennialist perspective, is just to return to the one, as it were, to escape the illusion of history? And if I'm mischaracterizing, please correct me. But do you understand the sort of religious intuition that I would uphold will be one wherein there is a historical process, the divine is involved in it, and that we are called to exercise a kind of freedom and love to bring about the culmination of this historical process, and that to simply say that historical time is illusory is to, in some ways, make that historical process meaningless, and our role as free human beings in that process meaningless. Do you understand what I'm?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I understand very well what the question you're raising, and I think they are the most important questions one can raise, and I wish we would have a full period to discuss these questions, but let me, in partial answer at least, tell you my view about these matters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, first of all, in regard to Platonism, I regard Platonism as inherently the same as the Vedic tradition. There's no essential difference of outlook between the Vedic outlook you find in the Upanishads and the Platonist outlook. And I would like to point out that whether you're talking the Vedic from the Vedic point of view or from the Platonist, in either case, the purpose of philosophy is not to bring anything down. This is how we in the West would think. No, the purpose is, on the contrary, to ascend from where we are now to the eternal plane. And let me tell you very, very briefly that in my case, after getting my doctorate, and I looked forward to a year that I spent in India. This was a long time ago when conditions still were very, very different, and the higher spirituality in India was far more accessible than it is presumably today. And so I spent about 7 months living amongst sadhus in remote parts of India, as it were, observing them, and to the extent that it was possible, speaking with them and asking them what I wanted to know. And the upshot of it is that I became convinced that whereas we speak abstractly and philosophically about the triple world, these ascetics actually travel in it on a daily basis. As a matter of fact, in Sanskrit, there is a Sanskrit term for the triple world. It's called the Tribhuvana, literally the three worlds. And these yogis that were still in existence 50 years ago when I was traveling there, on a daily basis would, as it were, go right through the intermediary, which is very dangerous, by the way, even if you could. It's in medieval Christendom, it was called the harrowing of hell, and few saints even ventured to do that. It's not child's play, these are realities, and there are yogic means of doing it. Whether they still exist today, I don't know. But getting back now to the Platonist tradition, I was very, very excited when not so long ago I learned from an English Platonist who should be much better known than he is, Thomas Taylor. He seems to have had some inside information about the Platonist and Pythagorean traditions, and in a fascinating book dealing with Pythagoras and the first book of Euclid, Thomas Taylor describes that a journey which the young Pythagoras made to Egypt. So when Pythagoras was a young man, he traveled to Egypt and became a disciple of one of the Egyptian masters. And Thomas Taylor describes their life, their discipline. And when I read this, I realized this is practically identical to what I myself witnessed in India amongst the sadhus. So first of all, this is something that you cannot do yourself. You can only enter into these higher realms through discipleship. Only one who has himself acquired this through a master, he can initiate you and put you through these disciplines, which, if all goes well, will then in the end enable you also to attain. Attain what? It is a matter of vision. It is a matter of sight. What both Pythagoras and Plato tried to instill in their disciples is the ability to actually live, if you will, on the avitonal level, to merge in that transcosmic vision of reality, direct, not through any intermediary. And incidentally, lifelong celibacy is a sine qua non. I learned that in India, and every 14-year-old Brahmin boy in India understands that if you're seeking God in that sense of this vision on the intelligible level, you have to sacrifice the ordinary worldly aims and ambitions that we all have. And so it is a way of celibacy, it's a way of purification. And the only point in which the Platonist Pythagorean tradition differs from the Vedic is this. In the Platonist yoga, if you want to use that term, geometry plays a key role. And to the best of my knowledge, this is nowhere to be found in the Vedic tradition. This is Western. And what is that role? Well, geometry as we understand it belongs to the intermediary plane. It is, if you will, a psychic. If you think of a circle or a sphere, this is a psychic construct. However, within that psychic construct, there is the eternal archetype. And so, in principle, it is possible to transition from geometry in the sense in which we all understand the term to a direct vision of intelligible reality. And this is a form of yoga, a form not known in India, but it is when I read about the actual life of these disciples, the celibacy and the mandatory initiation and the role of the guru, the spiritual guide, I realized this is part of the same overall tradition, and it gives you an entirely new way of understanding Platonism and the Pythagorean tradition, which are the same. Metaphysically, there's no difference there. So we in the West have to learn that, because these ideas are all very strange, and such ideas about religion as we have in the West are very, very different. And incidentally, there is a profound and irreducible difference between the Vedic and Platonist approach to religion on the one side and the Judeo-Christian on the other. And in today's culture, there is an enormous amount of confusion on this topic. And I'm totally convinced that the so-called perennialist school is mistaken, that they look upon the Judeo-Christian tradition through Vedantic eyes, and what you see through Vedantic eyes is always going to be Vedanta. The Judeo-Christian conceptions are simply not visible in Vedantic terms. So anyhow, I'm being very general in these remarks, but since you touched upon these themes, I just wanted to, in a word or two, give you my perspective on that. It's very different from the perennialists, and my understanding of Platonism, I must say, I owe squarely to the English Platonist Thomas Taylor. Where he got it from, I have no idea, but reading Thomas Taylor, I began to realize this is not a scholar who's learned things from books. Somehow he is an insider of this tradition.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I appreciate all that you've shared in the last 90 minutes or so. I wish we could go longer. Perhaps we can arrange to speak again at another time to go more into depth, particularly on this final topic. John, did you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to say thanks on behalf of the initiative. Thanks for having Wolfgang on, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to thank you too, Matthew. I'm very happy that you had me on, and these are very, very major issues, needless to say, which you raised, and God willing, perhaps we'll have another occasion to continue.
I hope so. All right. Well, thank you both. This is a great way to spend a Sunday morning.
I agree. Thank you so much. All the best to you, Matthew.